I never imagined my story would be one of those whispered tragedies, the kind you hear about happening to other people, not to you, not after a lifetime of what I believed was love and sacrifice. He called me Mom for 23 years, ever since his own mother, my dear sister Sarah, passed away, and I, without a second thought, took him into my heart and my home. Then, one ordinary Tuesday, under the guise of a doctor's visit, he and his wife, Tiffany, left me in the sterile, echoing quiet of a nursing home. Without a word, without a backward glance, the door clicked shut, not just on a room, but on everything I thought my life had been, everything I thought we had been. If this story finds you, perhaps you're in a place where you need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, and please, tell me where in the world you are watching from in the comments below. Stick around till the end, because sometimes, even in the deepest darkness, a flicker of light can find its way in. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I was 62 years old when my world tilted off its axis. I had been widowed young. My beloved Robert, a man of quiet strength and surprising foresight, was taken from me by a sudden illness far too soon. We never had children of our own, a quiet sorrow we both carried. Then, just a few years after Robert's passing, my younger sister Sarah, a vibrant soul with a streak of unfortunate luck in business and men, succumbed to cancer. She left behind her 10-year-old son, Mark. There was no question in my mind, no hesitation. He was blood, he was Sarah's boy, and he needed me. From that day forward, Mark became my son, the focus of my life, the vessel into which I poured all the maternal love I had stored up. I worked 2 jobs for years, as a librarian by day, and doing medical transcription in the evenings to ensure he lacked for nothing. I remember vividly the pride swelling in my chest as I watched him graduate from high school, the valedictorian no less. I scrimped and saved every penny to help him through college, celebrated his first real job, and then, later, I dug deep into my savings, the money Robert and I had carefully accumulated, to give him a substantial down payment for his first house. It was a small, charming bungalow, and I helped him paint the rooms, plant a garden. He was, in every way that mattered to my heart, my son. I thought that bond was unbreakable, forged in shared grief and unwavering love. I was wrong. So terribly, devastatingly wrong. The change began subtly, almost imperceptibly, after Mark married Tiffany. She was a woman who always seemed to be appraising everything and everyone, and I always felt I came up short in her estimations. Her smiles rarely reached her eyes, and her compliments, when they came, felt backhanded. Mark, who had always been so open and affectionate with me, became more reserved, his conversations often steered by Tiffany's subtle cues. Last spring, they approached me with a proposition. "Eleanor," Tiffany had said, her voice smooth as honey, Mark nodding beside her, "we've been thinking. You're rattling around in that big house all by yourself. Why don't you sell it and come live with us? We could build a lovely little granny flat in the backyard. It would be so much easier for us to look after you as you get older, keep an eye on things," Mark added. "It makes sense, Mom. We worry about you." Their words, on the surface, sounded like care, like concern. I, who had craved the closeness of family, who perhaps feared the encroaching loneliness of old age more than I admitted, latched onto the idea. I trusted them. Why wouldn't I trust my Mark? So, I sold my home, the house Robert and I had filled with laughter and dreams, my sanctuary of memories. I handed over a significant portion of the proceeds to Mark and Tiffany, nearly $200,000, for them to invest for me and to cover the costs of building that promised granny flat. The flat, of course, was never built. Excuses piled up: zoning issues, contractor delays, rising material costs. My money, they assured me, was safely invested and growing. Then came that Tuesday. Mark told me he was taking me to a new specialist, a doctor who could help with what he gently termed my increasing forgetfulness. I hadn't noticed much forgetfulness, perhaps misplacing my glasses more often, but at 62, it didn't seem alarming. Still, I trusted Mark. He drove me out to a place I didn't recognize, a sprawling building set back from the road called Willow Creek Manor. He walked me inside, into a small, sparsely furnished room. "Wait here, Mom," he said, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "I just need to get your paperwork from the car," he smiled, a quick, nervous twitch of his lips, and then he was gone. I waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence in that room began to press in on me, heavy and suffocating. Eventually, a kind-faced but busy nurse came in. "Eleanor," she asked. "Your nephew said you'd be expecting us." He signed the admission forms and left instructions. He said he'd call later. Nephew. Not son. Tiffany had packed a small, worn suitcase for me, filled mostly with old clothes I rarely wore, items I would have donated. My favorite books, my photographs, my small keepsakes, none of them were there. The life I knew, the love I'd given, the future I'd envisioned, all of it vanished with the click of a car door locking outside, a sound I didn't hear, but felt deep in my bones. The betrayal was absolute, a cold, sharp knife twisting in my soul. My Mark, the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose school plays I'd attended with a heart bursting with pride, whose tears I'd dried when his first girlfriend broke his heart. He had erased me. My dignity felt stripped away, my trust shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Confusion warred with a grief so profound it stole my breath. How could this be? Willow Creek Manor was meticulously clean, disinfected to the point of sterility, but it was utterly soulless. My room was small, functional, with a window that overlooked a vast, grey parking lot and a distant, indifferent highway. The funds Mark had supposedly managed for me were, according to the curt administrator I was eventually allowed to see, either depleted or inaccessible for my level of care. I was assigned a state-funded room, basic and impersonal. The new, upgraded phone Tiffany had insisted on getting for me a few weeks prior, promising it was simpler for me to use, mysteriously stopped working after the first day. No signal, no charge, nothing. I had no access to my bank accounts. Mark had become the joint signatory on everything after I'd sold my house and moved in with them, a move he'd framed as making it easier to help me manage things. I was trapped, isolated, and utterly dependent on the very people who had discarded me. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of bland meals, indifferent routines, and the hushed sorrows of other residents. Sleep offered little escape, haunted as it was by memories. I replayed every sacrifice I'd made for Mark, every loving gesture, every birthday party I'd thrown, every school event I'd attended, every late night I'd stayed up helping him with homework, or just listening to his dreams. Was I a fool? A naive, sentimental old woman? Had I been so blinded by my fierce, protective love for him, by my deep-seated need to be a mother, that I'd willingly ignored all the warning signs? Tiffany's subtle disdain, her possessiveness over Mark, Mark's increasing evasiveness whenever I asked about the granny flat, or the status of my investments, I remembered now, with a chilling clarity, conversations I'd dismissed at the time, Tiffany complaining about the burden of aging parents, Mark looking uncomfortable, but saying nothing to defend me. The pain was a constant, physical ache in my chest, a hollow, echoing emptiness where my heart used to be. How could he? The question tormented me, whispered in the lonely hours of the night, staring at the chipped paint on the wall of my room. What did I do to deserve this abandonment? Was my love not enough? Or was it too much, smothering him until he felt the need to sever ties so cruelly? I felt like a failure, not just as a caregiver, but as a human being. I tried, in those early weeks, to bridge the chasm they had created. I asked the overworked nurses, with as much dignity as I could muster, to help me call Mark. The numbers they dialed, the ones he'd left on the admission forms, either rang unanswered, filled with an ominous, unending tone, or went straight to a cold, impersonal voicemail. Tiffany's number, the one I still had memorized, was curtly reported as disconnected by an automated voice. My hands shook as I laboriously penned letters, pouring out my confusion, my hurt, my desperate plea for an explanation, for him to just come and talk to me, to look me in the eye and tell me why. I gave them to the front desk, hoping they would be mailed. I suspected, with a growing sense of dread, that they never left the building, or perhaps they were returned, marked addressee unknown, a final, cruel twist of the knife. Each unanswered call, each unsent letter, reinforced my isolation, deepened the wound until it felt bottomless. Rock bottom arrived not with a dramatic crash, but with a quiet, soul-crushing thud. It was an evening much like any other. Supper was served, a bowl of lukewarm, watery soup, a single, dry piece of bread, and a small, wilting salad. I remember staring at the tray, at the meager offerings, and then catching my reflection in the darkened window pane. I saw a gaunt, hollow-eyed old woman, her hair lank, her shoulders slumped in defeat. A stranger looked back at me, a forgotten relic. I hadn't been eating properly for days, the food tasted like ash in my mouth. The shame of being discarded, of being deemed so utterly worthless by the person I loved most in the world, was a crushing physical weight. I felt invisible, erased from my own life story. This was it, I thought with a chilling certainty. This sterile room, this profound loneliness, this was where I would fade away, another forgotten name in a long list of the unwanted elderly. Hope had withered and died, leaving only a barren landscape of despair. There seemed to be no fight left in me, just a weary resignation to a fate I had never anticipated, a fate I felt I hadn't deserved, yet was powerless to change. Then, a tiny, unexpected pinprick of light appeared in the oppressive darkness. A young woman named Sarah, a college student studying social work, began visiting Willow Creek Manor as a volunteer. She had bright, kind eyes and a patient demeanor that was a balm to my frayed nerves. She didn't treat me like a senile old woman or a burden. She spoke to me as an equal, listened to my halting stories of happier times, and sometimes, she just sat with me in companionable silence. One afternoon, several weeks into her visits, she offered to help me sort through the small, pathetic suitcase Tiffany had packed for me. I hadn't had the heart to do it myself. It felt like sifting through the debris of a shipwrecked life. As we went through the few items, mostly old cardigans and worn nightgowns, my fingers, fumbling inside the lining of an old, forgotten handbag I hadn't used in at least a decade, brushed against something stiff and unfamiliar. I pulled it out. It was a small, neatly folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. My heart gave a strange little flutter as I carefully unfolded it. It was a deposit slip, ancient and faded, for a safety deposit box at the downtown branch of a bank Robert and I had used many years ago. The box was opened decades ago, jointly in my name and Robert's. I stared at it, a whirlwind of forgotten memories swirling in my mind. Robert. My practical, meticulous Robert. He always was a planner, always thinking 10 steps ahead, always quietly preparing for any eventuality. I had completely forgotten about this box in the turmoil of grief after his death, and then in the busy years of raising Mark. A thought, tentative and fragile, began to form. What if there was something in it? Robert wasn't the type to keep an empty box. He was a man of purpose, of quiet intentions. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a tremor of something other than despair, something akin to a desperate, electric curiosity, ran through me. That small, faded slip of paper became an anchor in the turbulent sea of my emotions. It wasn't much, but it was something tangible, a connection to my past, to Robert, and potentially, to a future that wasn't dictated by Mark and Tiffany's cruelty. A tiny spark, no bigger than a firefly, ignited in the desolate landscape of my heart. Was it hope? Or perhaps just the fierce, primal instinct for survival reasserting itself? For the first time in months, I felt a stirring of purpose, a whisper of defiance against the crushing weight of my circumstances. Robert had been a careful man, a protector. He wouldn't have left me vulnerable if he could have helped it, even from beyond the grave. This safety deposit box was a thread, a very slender, almost invisible thread, but it was mine. It was a secret Mark and Tiffany knew nothing about. The immediate, overwhelming challenge was how to get to that bank. I was, for all intents and purposes, a prisoner of Willow Creek Manor. I had no money of my own, no working telephone, and certainly no freedom to come and go as I pleased. My forgetfulness, as Mark had so conveniently labeled it, was now my official status. But that little spark, that nascent flicker of hope, had ignited a new resolve. I looked at Sarah, the kind volunteer, who was watching me with a concerned expression. She had a good heart, a compassionate spirit. Perhaps she could help. The first step, I knew, was to find out if the box still existed and what I would need to access it. The thought of action, any action, after so long in passive despair, felt like a lifeline. I had to try. For Robert. For myself. With a deep breath, I decided to confide in Sarah. I showed her the aged deposit slip, my hand trembling slightly as I explained its significance, or rather, my desperate hope for its significance. Her usual bright expression softened into one of deep sympathy, quickly followed by a flash of righteous anger in her eyes on my behalf, as I haltingly recounted the story of Mark and Tiffany. To my immense relief, she didn't dismiss my hopes as the ramblings of a confused old woman. She agreed to help, her youthful energy a stark contrast to my own weariness, yet somehow infectious. Discreetly, during her own time, she made inquiries. The downtown bank still existed, under a new corporate name after a merger, but the branch was there. And yes, the safety deposit box registered to Eleanor and Robert Vance was still active, its fees having been automatically paid for years from an old, almost forgotten savings account Robert had set up for just such a purpose. Because the box was jointly in my name, and my signature was on file from all those years ago, I could access it with proper identification. My heart leaped thankfully. My old, expired driver's license, which was still valid as a form of photo ID, was tucked away in that same old purse. Sarah, ever practical, also remembered something from her social work studies, a free legal aid clinic for seniors that operated downtown. She suggested it might be a good place to get advice once we knew what, if anything, the box contained. The first crucial step was getting me to the bank. Sarah, bless her resourceful heart, concocted a story for the Willow Creek staff about taking me on an approved therapeutic outing to a local botanical garden. It was a white lie, but one that felt entirely justified under the circumstances. The head nurse, Mrs. Davis, who had always seemed a little more perceptive than the others, gave me a long, searching look but eventually signed the permission slip, perhaps sensing a desperation in me that transcended my official diagnosis of mild cognitive decline. The trip to the legal aid clinic came after our clandestine visit to the bank. There, a young, sharp-eyed lawyer named Ms. Angela Chen listened with extraordinary patience and growing indignation as I recounted the entirety of my ordeal, Mark's upbringing, my sacrifices, the sale of my house, that invested money, Tiffany's manipulations, and my eventual abandonment. Her expression hardened as I spoke, particularly when I detailed the financial aspects of the betrayal. The existence of the safety deposit box, and whatever it might hold, became pivotal in her eyes. If it contained assets unknown to Mark and Tiffany, it could be my leverage, the very foundation upon which I could begin to rebuild my life and seek justice. Those clandestine trips out of Willow Creek, the hushed planning sessions with Sarah, the serious, focused discussions with Ms. Chen, they began to transform me from the inside out. The heavy fog of despair that had enveloped me for so long started to lift, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. I found myself eating again, not just going through the motions, but actually tasting the food. I started to take more care with my appearance, brushing my hair with more vigor, choosing my cleanest, least worn clothes from the meager selection I had. A quiet, steely determination began to settle deep within me, displacing the crushing weight of helplessness. I was no longer just Eleanor Vance, the discarded, forgotten old woman. I was Eleanor Vance, a woman with a secret, a woman with allies, a woman with a plan. My voice, when I spoke to Ms. Chen, detailing the transactions and timelines I could recall, was steadier, clearer. The hesitant, tearful woman who had first entered her office was gradually being replaced by someone more resolute, someone who was beginning to remember her own strength. With Sarah's invaluable assistance, she borrowed a wheelchair from Willow Creek for authenticity and navigated me through the city streets. With a cheerful determination, I finally reached the bank. My heart pounded in my chest as we were ushered into a small, private room. The bank manager, a kindly older gentleman named Mr. Henderson, actually remembered Robert. "A fine man, your husband," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Meticulous. Always looked out for you, Mrs. Vance." His words were a comfort and an affirmation. The old signature card was produced, and my shaky signature, though aged, matched the confident script from decades past. With a click and a whir, the long, slender metal box was retrieved from the vault and placed before me. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. My breath caught in my throat. Inside, nestled amongst neatly bundled papers, were bearer bonds, scores of them, purchased steadily by Robert over many years, now fully matured and worth a considerable sum. And deeds. There were deeds to a small, unassuming commercial property in a then undeveloped part of the city, a property Robert had inherited from a distant relative and had quietly leased out. The rental income, I would soon learn from Ms. Chen's investigation, had been managed by a small, independent trust he'd astutely set up, also in my name. This trust was to be activated upon his death or, and this was the crucial part, my medically certified incapacitation, or if I was otherwise unable to manage my own affairs, a clause I had never known existed, a safeguard he had put in place without fanfare. And there, right on top, was the original deed to my house, the very house I had sold, along with meticulously kept copies of all the paperwork showing the transfer of the sale proceeds directly into an account controlled solely by Mark. Robert, my quiet, unassuming Robert, had, from beyond the grave, provided me with the arsenal I so desperately needed. When Miss Chen later reviewed the documents, particularly the trust details revealing passively collected rental income that had accrued for years, untouched and unknown to me, she was, in her own composed way, ecstatic. I was not penniless. I was not powerless. Far, far from it. The knowledge was like a dam breaking, a flood of relief, gratitude, and a fierce, righteous anger washed through me. The first strategic move orchestrated by Ms. Chen was swift and decisive. Citing irrefutable evidence of elder financial abuse and my incapacitation, a status ironically imposed by Mark's actions of placing me in the home against my will and severing my access to my own funds, she successfully petitioned the court to freeze all the joint accounts Mark controlled. He, who had grown accustomed to easy access to what he considered his money, suddenly found himself cut off. The investments he had supposedly made with the proceeds from my house sale were, as Miss Chen's preliminary investigations suggested, largely fictitious, or had been squandered on luxuries for himself and Tiffany. The demand letter she then sent to Mark and Tiffany, formally requesting the immediate return of the misappropriated funds from my house sale, plus damages for emotional distress and fraudulent conduct, was ignored, met with arrogant silence. They clearly believed I was still isolated and powerless. The real shock for them, the one that shattered their complacency, arrived not as a letter, but as a legally binding eviction notice. The house they lived in, the house Mark had inherited from his mother, my sister Sarah, the house I had poured my own money and effort into maintaining for years and then, in a moment of trusting foolishness, had signed over completely to him with the loving, verbal understanding that he would always care for me, held a secret. A secret even I hadn't fully grasped until Ms. Chen pieced it together from Robert's meticulous records in the safety deposit box. Years ago, long before her illness, my sister Sarah, ever the hopeful entrepreneur, but unlucky in execution, had taken out a significant second mortgage on that house with a private, somewhat obscure lender to fund a business venture that subsequently failed. Robert, ever my sister's quiet protector and wanting to spare her the shame and me the worry, had discreetly bought out that entire mortgage. He never told Sarah, and he never told me, perhaps not wanting to cause family friction or make her feel indebted. He simply held the note, preventing foreclosure. That original loan note, legally assigned to Robert and subsequently to the very trust he had established for my protection, was resting safely in the safety deposit box. Mark, in his ignorance and arrogance, had been living in a house that was effectively mortgaged to me, or rather, to the trust Robert had so presciently set up. By abandoning me and misappropriating my funds, he had, under the terms of that old family understanding which underpinned Robert's silent financial intervention, defaulted spectacularly. Ms. Chen, acting decisively on behalf of the trust, had called in the loan. The confrontation, when it came, was not in a courtroom, but in the drab, institutional visitors' lounge of Willow Creek Manor. Mark and Tiffany stormed in, not contrite or apologetic, but radiating fury and disbelief. Mark, his face flushed and his voice tight with anger, started shouting before he even reached me. "What in God's name have you done, Eleanor? You're trying to ruin us. This is insane." Tiffany, usually so composed and superior, was pale, her expensive handbag clutched so tightly her knuckles were white. Her customary arrogance had been replaced by a shrewish panic that was almost pitiable, if not for the cruelty she had inflicted. I sat calmly in one of the worn vinyl chairs, Sarah, my young volunteer friend, a steadfast presence beside me. Miss Chen was present too, her calm, authoritative voice on speakerphone from her office. I said very little as Mark raged. When he finally paused for breath, I looked at him, really looked at him, searching for any flicker of the boy I had raised. "You left me here, Mark," I said, my voice quiet, but surprisingly firm, carrying clearly in the suddenly silent room. "You took everything I had. Or so you thought." Miss Chen then took over, her voice a cool counterpoint to Mark's heated accusations. She calmly and methodically explained the legal standing of the Vance Protection Trust, the undeniable validity of the loan note secured by their primary residence, and the clear evidence of financial elder abuse, which had led to the freezing of their assets. "Your Aunt Eleanor's trust," Ms. Chen stated, her tone leaving no room for argument, "is exercising its legal right to foreclose on the property due to significant default on the loan conditions, which included an implicit, and now explicitly violated, covenant of care and financial rectitude concerning Mrs. Vance. This is, of course, in addition to the civil claims for the recovery of misappropriated funds from her house sale, plus considerable damages." Mark and Tiffany stared, mouths agape, as Miss Chen detailed the sums involved. The total was astronomical, far beyond anything they could hope to repay, especially now with their access to my money severed. Tiffany finally crumpled, letting out a choked sob. "She can't do this. It's his house. His mother left it to him. Her tears were not of remorse, I noted with a strange detachment, but of pure, unadulterated rage and thwarted greed. Actually, Ms. Chen corrected smoothly, while your husband, Mr. Miller, holds the title, the Vance Protection Trust holds the primary, and now defaulted, lien. For all intents and purposes, due to the outstanding debt, which significantly exceeds the property's current market value post your acquisitions, it is, effectively, the Trust's house to reclaim. Unless, of course, she added, a slight pause for emphasis, the full amount of the misappropriated funds from Mrs. Vance's previous home sale, along with accrued interest, penalties, legal fees, and the entire outstanding balance of the original note are repaid immediately. A heavy silence descended. The sum was clearly impossible for them. I looked directly at Mark then, the boy I had loved as my own, the man who had betrayed that love so profoundly. There was no trace of the child I remembered in his panicked, grasping expression, only a defeated, selfish man confronting the consequences of his choices. You had a choice, Mark, I said, my voice still quiet, but imbued with a newfound strength I hadn't known I possessed. You and Tiffany made your decisions when you left me here, when you emptied my accounts. Now, I am making mine. The power dynamic in that room had irrevocably shifted. They had sought to erase me, but thanks to Robert's love and foresight, and my own dawning resolve, I was anything but. The fallout for Mark and Tiffany was swift and brutal. Unable to meet the demands of the trust or contest the foreclosure, with their funds frozen and their actions laid bare, they were forced to vacate the house within weeks. The trust, my trust, took possession. Ms. Chen's forensic accountants discovered they had squandered the majority of my house money on a ridiculously lavish lifestyle of expensive cars, designer clothes, exotic holidays, and a string of bad investments in fly-by-night schemes Tiffany had championed. What little remained in their personal accounts was quickly consumed by their own mounting legal fees and daily expenses. They ended up in a cramped, run-down rental apartment on the other side of town, a stark contrast to the spacious home they had so casually usurped. The shiny, leased cars were repossessed one by one, much to the delight of their gossiping former neighbors. Tiffany, who had always prized status and material wealth above all else, found she couldn't cope with the drastic downturn in their fortunes, or with a husband who was no longer a provider of luxuries, but a source of debt and shame. She left Mark within 6 months, reportedly moving in with a wealthier, older acquaintance. Mark, alone, discredited, and effectively broke, struggled to find employment. Word of his treatment of me, and the subsequent financial ruin, had spread quickly through their relatively small community, making him a pariah. Several months later, a much-changed Mark appeared at Willow Creek Manor again. He was alone this time, disheveled and looking years older than his actual age. He wasn't aggressive or demanding, he was broken. He sat across from me in that same visitor's lounge, no longer raging, but weeping openly, shoulders shaking. He begged for my forgiveness, rambling about how he'd been manipulated by Tiffany, how he never meant for things to go so far, how he'd been weak and greedy. "I miss you, Mom," he choked out, the word Mom sounding foreign yet painfully familiar on his lips. It was the first time in what felt like a lifetime he had called me that, not Eleanor or Aunt Eleanor, but Mom. His tears seemed genuine, born of desperation and perhaps, just perhaps, a dawning, painful realization of the enormity of his betrayal. Listening to him, I felt a complex swirl of emotions. The raw, gaping wound of his betrayal was still there, a dull ache in my soul, but it no longer had the power to incapacitate me. There was a strange, bittersweet vindication in seeing him brought so low, but it was overshadowed by a profound sadness for the boy he once was, for the son I thought I had. "Mark," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "love isn't a weapon to be used against someone, nor is it a currency to be hoarded or spent carelessly. And it's certainly not a tap, that can be turned on and off to suit your convenience. What you and Tiffany did, it nearly destroyed me. You treated me as if I were nothing, a piece of old furniture to be discarded when it no longer served a purpose. I didn't offer him false comfort, or immediate, easy absolution. My own healing was my priority now, a journey I was only just beginning. Shortly after that encounter, with Miss Chen's capable assistance and the resources from Robert's trust, I moved out of Willow Creek Manor. Sarah, my wonderful young friend, helped me find and decorate a comfortable, sunny apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It felt like stepping out of a long, dark tunnel into the light. Sarah remained a steadfast friend, a bright spot in my newly configured life. Her youthful optimism and unwavering support were invaluable. Miss Chen evolved from just my lawyer into a trusted advisor and confidant, a formidable advocate who fiercely protected my interests. I began, cautiously at first, to reconnect with old friends, people Mark and Tiffany had subtly, or not so subtly, pushed out of my life during their campaign to isolate me. It was a joy to rediscover those bonds. The commercial property Robert had so astutely held on to provided a steady, comfortable income, more than enough for my needs, allowing me a sense of security I hadn't felt in years. I was no longer dependent on anyone. My new apartment was my sanctuary, bright and airy, filled with flowers, the scent of baking. I'd rediscovered my love for it, and shelves overflowing with books I finally had the peace of mind to read. I had complete control over my finances, my schedule, my life. I was Eleanor Vance, a survivor, a woman of independent means, beholden to absolutely no one. The quiet of my own home was no longer a symbol of loneliness, but of profound peace and contentment. I could sit for hours by my window, watching the world go by, without the oppressive weight of despair, or the fear of what tomorrow might bring. With my newfound freedom and resources, I found myself wanting to give back, to make some meaning out of the pain I had endured. I started volunteering several days a week at a local animal shelter, a passion I'd harbored for years, but never had the time or energy to pursue. The unconditional affection of the dogs and cats was incredibly healing. I also made a significant, anonymous donation to the very legal aid clinic that had been my lifeline, specifically earmarking the funds to support elderly victims of financial abuse and exploitation. It felt good to know that perhaps my story could, in some small way, help prevent others from suffering a similar fate. I even established a small, discreet fund through Sarah, who continued her volunteer work, to provide small comforts and necessities for some of the more isolated and financially struggling residents back at Willow Creek Manor, things like better quality toiletries, warm shawls, or subscriptions to magazines. It was a way of acknowledging the kindnesses I had received, and the suffering I had witnessed. Looking back, I learned that unconditional love, while a beautiful ideal, should never, ever mean unconditional suffering, or the erasure of one's own needs and worth. I learned that being a mother, even to a child not born from your own body, is a sacred and precious trust, and when that trust is so cruelly betrayed, the pain is almost unbearable, a grief that cuts to the very core of your being. But through that agonizing crucible, I also discovered a strength within myself, a resilience I never knew I possessed. Robert's meticulous foresight, his quiet, steadfast love reaching out to protect me even after he was gone, was an incredible gift, a foundation upon which I could rebuild. But finding my own voice, summoning the courage to fight back, and meticulously, strategically reclaiming my life and my dignity, that was my own doing. I had walked through fire, and I had emerged, not unscathed, but whole and stronger. Mark? He calls occasionally. His voice is always hesitant, tinged with a sadness that may or may not be genuine remorse. I am polite, but distant. Forgiveness, I've come to understand, is a complex, personal journey, not a simple destination one arrives at, and certainly not an obligation. Perhaps one day I will find it in my heart to fully forgive him, for my own peace more than his. But my life is unequivocally my own now. I built it back, piece by piece, from the ashes of a devastating betrayal, crafting a new existence filled with purpose, independence, and a quiet, profound joy. And it is good. It is more than good, it is mine. Thanks for listening to my story. It wasn't easy to share, but if it resonates with even one person, then it was worth it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience and transformation. And please, feel free to share your own experiences or thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your story deserves to be heard.